Rest isn't fixing you. Here's why. You rested. You went to bed early. You slept 8, maybe 9 hours. You took a weekend off, stayed away from the emails, avoided the meetings. You gave yourself the break that every productivity article told you to take. And then Monday came. And you were still tired. Not just physically tired, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes, that makes decisions feel like lifting weight, that turns simple conversations into something you have to survive rather than have. The kind of tired that sleep does not seem to touch. Most people at this point reach the same conclusion: I need more rest. So they rest more. They sleep longer. They disconnect further. They build elaborate rituals around recovery: blackout curtains, magnesium supplements, digital detoxes. And some of it helps for a while. Until it doesn't. Here is the question that most people never stop to ask. What if rest isn't the problem, and therefore more rest isn't the solution? What if the exhaustion you carry isn't a product of insufficient downtime, but of something happening inside you that rest, by itself, has never been designed to fix? That is what this video is about. Not rest as a lifestyle choice. Not burnout as a wellness category. We are going to look at the actual mechanisms, the cognitive architecture, the neurological systems, the behavioral patterns, that determine whether rest restores you or simply delays the same exhaustion by a few hours. Because the model most people operate from is not just incomplete. It is wrong. And until you understand why it's wrong, you will keep doing the same things and wondering why they stop working. Let's start at the beginning. The mental model most people carry looks like this. Work drains you. Rest restores you. More work requires more rest. The solution to exhaustion is therefore straightforward: reduce the drain, increase the recovery period. This is the battery model of human energy. It is intuitive. It is clean. It is almost entirely wrong. The battery model assumes that depletion and recovery are two sides of the same linear process, that the same mechanism that empties you can simply be run in reverse. But that is not how human beings function. We are not batteries. We are biological systems with multiple interdependent processes operating simultaneously, and the factors that deplete us are not always the factors that appear most obvious. Here is where the model breaks down. Rest is not the opposite of work. Rest is the absence of deliberate external activity. But absence of activity is not the same as recovery. Recovery requires specific conditions to occur, and those conditions have almost nothing to do with how long you lie still. When you understand that distinction, the experience of lying in bed exhausted after a full night's sleep makes complete sense. You rested. You did not recover. They are not the same thing. Ask most people what makes them tired, and they will describe the volume of work. The hours. The meetings. The deadlines. They understand exhaustion as a function of output. The more you produce, the more depleted you become. But this explanation has a problem. It doesn't account for the people who are exhausted despite producing very little. The people who are drained by a single conversation. The people who wake up tired from a sleep that, by every external measure, should have restored them. What those people are carrying is not physical fatigue. It is cognitive and emotional load, and these are fundamentally different in their source, their accumulation, and their resolution. Physical fatigue has a relatively straightforward recovery mechanism. Muscles rebuild. Sleep clears metabolic waste. The body knows what to do. But cognitive load, the weight of unresolved decisions, open questions, pending obligations, suppressed emotions, maintained appearances, this does not clear on its own simply because you stopped working. Here is where the concept of allostatic load becomes essential. Allostatic load is the cumulative cost to the body of adapting to chronic stress. Every time you face a stressor, a difficult conversation, an unresolved conflict, an approaching deadline, an ambiguous situation, your stress response activates. Cortisol rises. Attention sharpens. Your system prepares for action. And when the stressor is resolved, the response is supposed to deactivate. The problem is this: many of the stressors in modern life are never fully resolved. They persist. The email you haven't answered. The conversation you're dreading. The decision you keep postponing. Each of these maintains a low but continuous activation of your stress system. The critical point here is that allostatic load does not pause when you stop working. You can be sitting completely still, no phone, no screen, no obligation, and your body is still maintaining the physiological cost of every unresolved stress it is carrying. Your cortisol levels do not drop simply because you have put down your laptop. Your nervous system does not reset simply because the room is quiet. This is why so many people describe rest as feeling unearned or wasted. They lie down but feel anxious. They take a walk but their mind keeps returning to the same problems. They are not failing to rest properly. They are experiencing the very real consequence of trying to recover in the presence of an unresolved load that the body refuses to set down. There is a network in your brain that most people have never heard of, but that most people spend the majority of their waking and resting hours inside. It is called the default mode network, the set of brain regions that activate when you are not engaged in focused external tasks. When you stop working, when you close your eyes, when you let your attention drift, the default mode network comes online. For a long time, neuroscientists assumed that this network represented a kind of neural idle state. The brain at rest, doing nothing particularly significant. That assumption was wrong. The default mode network is not passive. It is highly active, and it is engaged in a specific set of processes: self-referential thinking, social cognition, memory consolidation, and, critically, the mental simulation of unresolved scenarios. In other words, when you stop paying deliberate attention to your problems, your brain doesn't stop processing them. It replays them. This is why lying in bed after a hard week does not feel like nothing. Your brain is running through the conversation you had badly. It is rehearsing the presentation you haven't prepared. It is cycling through the decision you haven't made. You are not resting. You are mentally rehearsing, without the benefit of reaching any conclusion. The second mechanism that explains why rest fails is attention residue, a concept developed by organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy. The finding is this: when you switch away from a task before it is complete, or before you have reached a point of psychological closure, a portion of your cognitive resources remains allocated to that task. You carry it forward. Even when you are doing something else entirely, some part of your attention is still on what you left unfinished. Attention residue is not metaphorical. It measurably degrades performance on whatever you move to next. It reduces working memory capacity. It slows response time. And it persists even when you are consciously unaware of it. Now consider what this means for rest. You finish work at 7 in the evening. You haven't completed 3 tasks on your list. You haven't replied to 2 important messages. You haven't resolved the tension from the afternoon's difficult exchange. You have simply stopped. Not finished. Not closed. Stopped. And then you sit down to rest. Attention residue means you didn't bring yourself to the couch. You brought yourself plus the 3 unfinished tasks, the 2 unanswered messages, the unresolved tension. All of that is consuming cognitive resources. All of it is running in the background. None of it is resting. There is a distinction that most conversations about recovery completely ignore, and it is the distinction that separates people who genuinely recover from those who simply pause. Passive rest is what most people default to: lying down, watching television, scrolling through feeds, doing nothing in particular. These activities share a common property: they do not require you to complete anything. They offer stimulation without obligation. They keep your attention occupied without resolving anything. This is not nothing. Passive rest can reduce immediate overstimulation. It can lower the acute arousal that comes from an intense work period. But it does not address the underlying load. It does not close open loops. It does not provide the cognitive system with the signal it needs to truly disengage. Active recovery, by contrast, is not more work. It is structured disengagement, deliberate actions taken specifically to create the conditions in which recovery can actually occur. It involves closure rather than continuation, offloading rather than suppression, transition rather than abrupt stopping. The difference is not about effort. It is about mechanism. Passive rest asks nothing of you and delivers minimal returns. Active recovery asks specific things of you, briefly, deliberately, and creates the conditions for genuine cognitive restoration. Most people, when they feel exhausted, instinctively reach for passive rest. And this makes intuitive sense. They are depleted, and passive rest feels like the least taxing option. But the irony is that passive rest, when applied to a mind still carrying unresolved cognitive load, often leaves people feeling neither rested nor restored. They emerge from 3 hours of television feeling vaguely guilty, slightly duller, and still tired. That feeling has a cause. The load was never addressed. The loops kept running. The stimulation of passive rest, the constant novelty of a scrolling feed, the low-grade engagement of background television, actually competes with the default mode network's attempts to process and resolve unfinished mental business. Passive rest doesn't give you nothing. It often gives you less than nothing. It interrupts potential processing while providing no resolution. Here is a useful analogy, one that illuminates the mechanism before we break it down. Consider a computer with 30 minimized windows. From the outside, the desktop looks clean. Nothing is visible. The screen might even be sleeping. But in the background, all 30 of those minimized windows are still running. The browser is still loading. The video is still buffered. The spreadsheet is still calculating. The system resources are being consumed, continuously, by processes that appear to have been closed but were only hidden. The machine is doing nothing visible. It is doing a great deal invisible. Your mind, during rest, operates by the same logic. The minimized windows are your suppressed thoughts, the email you told yourself you'd deal with tomorrow, the conversation you mentally filed away rather than resolved, the worry you pushed beneath conscious attention because you decided it wasn't the moment. They are minimized. They are not closed. The background processes are your unresolved cognitive loops, the default mode network's continuous attempt to simulate outcomes, rehearse scenarios, and reach closure on questions that were never actually answered. They are invisible. They are not inactive. This is why telling someone who is exhausted to just rest is insufficient advice. Not because rest is wrong, but because rest without addressing what is running in the background will not restore the system. You can let the screen go dark. The processes continue. The broken analogy is this. Unlike a computer, you cannot simply force quit your cognitive background processes. You cannot open a task manager and kill the loops. But you can create the conditions in which those loops reach resolution. And that is a fundamentally different action from simply lying down. The goal is not to stop thinking. It is to stop thinking unproductively, to replace rumination with resolution, suppression with processing, open loops with closure. Understanding why rest fails is incomplete without identifying the specific behavioral patterns that actively maintain the load. These are not dramatic failures. They are ordinary habits, most of them culturally encouraged, none of them obviously harmful, which is exactly what makes them dangerous. Every time you shift attention from one task or stimulus to another, from work to message, from message to news, from news back to work, you create a small but real cognitive cost. Each switch requires your attention system to reorient, to reload context, to rebuild focus. And as documented in the research on attention residue, each switch also leaves a trace of the previous task still active in working memory. In an age of perpetual notification and multitasking mythology, most people are switching contexts dozens of times per hour. The cumulative cost of this is not trivial. By the end of a day dominated by context switching, the attention system is not just fatigued, it is fragmented. And fragmented attention cannot recover during rest, because rest doesn't defragment. Only closure defragments. Most people end their workday not by completing tasks but by running out of time. The task is not finished, it is interrupted. The file is not saved and closed, it is left open. The conversation is not concluded, it is postponed. Each of these leaves an open cognitive loop that continues consuming mental resources after the work has officially stopped. Attention residue accumulates not as a single instance but as a compounding stack of unclosed items. By the end of a week, the average knowledge worker may be carrying the residue of dozens of tasks that were interrupted rather than completed. When you experience a difficult emotion, frustration, anxiety, resentment, uncertainty, and you decide, consciously or not to process it, you do not eliminate it. You store it. The body maintains the physiological correlates of that emotion, the tension, the arousal, the altered cortisol profile, even after the feeling has been pushed out of conscious awareness. And during rest, that stored emotional load continues to consume resources. The body is still managing it. The nervous system is still holding the activation pattern. You feel it as the vague, undirected unease that accompanies supposedly relaxing activities. The restlessness that makes genuine stillness feel impossible. The human attention system evolved for an environment with relatively low informational density. The modern environment presents it with a continuous, high-frequency stream of novel inputs, notifications, updates, recommendations, alerts, each of which triggers a small orienting response, a brief cortisol uptick, a momentary allocation of attention. Individually, each stimulus is trivial. Cumulatively, across a day of continuous digital exposure, the attention system is left in a state of chronic low-level arousal that does not resolve simply because the screen is turned off. The damage done by overstimulation is not merely to concentration. It is to the recovery mechanism itself. A nervous system habituated to constant stimulation develops a reduced capacity for the kind of quietude required for deep rest. Turning off the phone does not retrain the nervous system. It only removes the source. The pattern persists. The critique is only useful if it points towards something actionable. So let us be precise about what the research actually supports, not as wellness advice, but as mechanism. Closure is the first and most structurally important intervention. This does not mean finishing everything before you rest. That is not achievable and not the point. Closure means creating a defined psychological boundary between active work and non-work periods. It means ending your workday with a brief review of what has been completed and what is being deliberately parked, not abandoned or ignored, but consciously deferred. This process works not by completing tasks but by removing them from active working memory. You are signaling to the cognitive system that these items are being tracked externally. They do not need to remain in the foreground. The mechanism here is precise. When an open loop is written down and explicitly assigned to a future time, attention residue is measurably reduced. The brain's attempt to hold the item in memory is satisfied by the external record. The loop can close, temporarily, without being resolved. The working memory system has a limited capacity, and one of the primary costs of modern cognitive life is the quantity of active items it is asked to maintain simultaneously. Every uncaptured obligation, every unwritten idea, every unresolved question occupies working memory capacity, not as a discrete file, but as a background process that must be continuously refreshed to prevent its loss. Writing things down is not a productivity technique. It is a working memory intervention. When you capture an obligation externally, you remove the burden of maintaining it internally. The working memory slot it occupied becomes available. The cognitive cost of holding it is eliminated. For rest, this is significant. A person who ends their workday with their obligations still held internally brings all of that load into their rest period. The mind continues refreshing those items to avoid losing them, competing with any attempt at genuine mental disengagement. External capture breaks this cycle, not by solving the problem, by giving the mind permission to let it go. The transition from active work to genuine rest is not instantaneous, and treating it as such is one of the most common and costly errors in recovery practice. The nervous system requires time to down-regulate from a state of focused work engagement. Reducing informational inputs in the period before rest, avoiding screens, news, and high-stimulation content in the hour before sleep, is not about missing out. It is about removing the primary obstacle to down-regulation. The nervous system cannot be instructed to calm down, but it can be deprived of the inputs that maintain arousal, and given sufficient time to find its own equilibrium. Deliberate disengagement is the fourth mechanism, and it is the most structural. It refers to the design of a genuine transition between work and rest, a period that is explicitly neither. A walk that is not also a podcast. A meal that is not also a screen. A conversation that is not also a review of the day's problems. These transitional periods serve a specific neurological function. They allow the attention system to release its task orientation without simply replacing it with passive stimulation. Deliberate disengagement is not about what you do during this transition. It is about what you do not do. You do not introduce new information. You do not demand further decision-making. You do not continue in any form the cognitive activity you are attempting to close. You create, deliberately, a gap between work and rest. And it is in that gap that genuine downregulation can begin. We need to revise the definition. Rest is not what you stop doing externally. It is what continues, or does not continue, internally. By this definition, a person lying still in a darkened room with their mind rehearsing tomorrow's conflict is not resting. They are cognitively active in a context that removes their ability to act on that activity. They are expending cognitive energy without any productive output. They are neither working nor recovering. They are stuck. And a person who has completed a deliberate end-of-day closure, offloaded their open obligations, reduced their inputs, and created a genuine transition from work, that person, watching something light on television, or cooking a meal, or sitting in a garden, is recovering. Not because the activity is inherently restorative, but because the internal conditions that allow recovery have been established. The revision matters because it changes where you intervene. If rest is defined as the absence of external activity, then the solution to poor rest is more or better external inactivity. Longer sleep, more time off, stricter boundaries around work hours. All of these help at the margins. None of them addresses the root condition. If rest is defined as the absence of unresolved internal activity, then the solution requires something different. Attention to the cognitive and emotional load you carry into rest. Resolution of what can be resolved. Structured containment of what cannot. Reduction of the inputs that perpetuate arousal. Creation of genuine transitional space. This is a more demanding definition, because it requires you to take responsibility for something that feels involuntary, the activity of your own mind. But it is the accurate one. And accuracy, in this context, is not a consolation. It is the precondition for change. Let us be precise about what has actually been argued here, not as a summary, but as a final clarification. The claim is not that rest is useless. The claim is that rest, as most people practice it, addresses the symptom, the feeling of tiredness, without addressing the cause. The cause is not insufficient sleep. It is not insufficient downtime. It is not even insufficient self-care, in the current usage of that phrase. The cause is a cognitive system that is never fully allowed to close. A stress response that is perpetually maintained by unresolved obligations, suppressed emotions, and constant stimulation. A default mode network that replays problems rather than resolving them. An attention system so fragmented by context switching that it can no longer enter the sustained, undirected state in which restoration occurs. The exhaustion you carry is not evidence of laziness. It is not evidence of weakness. It is not even evidence of overwork, in most cases. It is evidence of a recovery system that has been bypassed, not deliberately, but because no one told you it existed. You were told to rest. You were not told what rest actually requires to function. So you rested. And you woke up tired. And you assumed you hadn't rested enough. And you rested more. And the loop continued. What you were actually doing, in every hour of rest that failed to restore you, was running the same program without clearing the cache. The same unresolved conversations. Here is what I want to leave you with. You don't feel tired because you didn't rest. You feel tired because your mind never stopped working. And here is the question that matters. What are you carrying into your rest that never gets resolved? That question is not comfortable. It is also not optional. Not if you want the rest you take to actually work. The rest is not the problem. It never was. What lives inside the rest, that is where the work begins.